Okay, so welcome back after the lunch break, and welcome to roughly 50 minutes about free and open source licenses. So pretty dry topic, but I hope that we can do that in a way that it's a little useful for you. There's one slide that no license talk can go without, and that's the disclaimer that we're not doing any legal advice. We are just talking a bit about licenses, and the big hint, whenever you do something that might involve money, either your own money or like others' money or reputation or anything that you or someone else would potentially fight for, make sure that you ask a lawyer first, because as always in law, it's difficult. And if you ask two lawyers, you get at least 3 opinions, and that's not different in licensing law. There are different jurisdictions in the world. There are different approaches to law. There are different interpretations of licenses and law. So someone might come to the exact opposite conclusions to what I'm telling you today, and make sure you know where you're standing, make sure you have someone else who's liable for what you're doing. But I think today we can at least get a rough idea about what's going on with software licenses. One slide about me at LPI. My name is Fabian, as you've probably seen. My primary field is Linux, virtualization, security, networking, and I spend a lot of my time working for a Canadian nonprofit called LPI. We basically do certifications for individuals, meaning we have a series of tests, and if people pass those tests, they get a certificate from us that we believe they are good in what they are doing. I'd explain at the end a little why we were working in the field of software licenses since a bit, but first of all, let's take a look to those licenses. So I assume, since you're at an open source conference, that basically all of you somehow have written a program or have written some documentation or have done some, maybe photos. So all of you in your life will probably have created something that can be considered a work. So all of us are authors. So we created something, and by the pure act of creating it, we have certain rights in what we created. The nice thing about those rights is that they allow us to define what other people can do with our works, or if they can do something with it at all. Unfortunately, on everything else that exists in the world, another author also has a right. And that author in return can prevent us from doing something or allow us to do something, depending on what? Depending on certain legal circumstances. Whatever we do in this area must somehow be backed up by a legal allowance or some legal base. And there are 2 potential sources where this could come from. One of them is the law. There is a lot of law in the world saying someone is allowed to do this and someone is allowed to do that. On the other hand, there are individual contracts, agreements. Any one of you can enter into an agreement with me, for example, to allow me to use, for example, source code that you've written. And you can tie that to certain circumstances, saying, for example, you allow this, but in return you expect something from me, which could be money or which could be a certain kind of behavior. When we talk about software licenses, most people consider those licenses contracts. Contracts between 2 entities, one entity granting rights to the other using those rights and in return being subject to certain obligations. The classic license agreements, like those 200-page thing that you have to check, I read and understood it when you install software that you bought somewhere, probably in the States. Those typical license agreements somehow try to limit rights. They try to really tell you what you're allowed, and even worse, what you're not allowed to do with their software. They're trying to keep control of their software. They want to make sure that they can monetize it however they want. Free and open source license works mostly like the opposite. They are trying to encourage the distribution of the software. They are trying to encourage others to improve the software, to change the software, and they even try to encourage others to share those derivative works with others. When we try to somehow get an idea about those open source licenses, there are certain definitions in the world. One of them comes from the Free Software Foundation, and they have those 4 freedoms that they think free software should bring, which is running the program for any purpose, which is studying how the programs work, changing it, having access to the source code in order to do so, redistributing copies, and also distributing modified versions of it. There are other or similar definitions about what open source is. Another pretty famous one can be found at the Open Source Initiative. But for our purpose, let's stick with this rough idea of trying to allow others to take a look to the software, to change it, and to distribute it. In order to do so, everybody trying to do that needs a legal base, which usually is this license agreement. And usually you enter into this agreement just by executing rights underneath it. So you get the software, there's a license file attached, that's something like an offer from the original author, and you accept that offer by, for example, modifying and distributing this software. The problem is with those licenses that there are so many of them around. And they can be categorized in certain different categories. All of them bring certain rights and obligations, but, for example, they differ in what are you allowed to do with the software, what are you allowed to do with your modifications, and what license is applicable to those modifications, and mostly it's tied to distribution, so it matters whether or not you keep those changes for yourself or if you want to share them with someone else. Quite all of those licenses allow at least running a program, creating a backup, and trying to debug it for your own purposes. That's something you get in common from almost all of them, and even that's something that you get from most copyright law in the world, so it's not even a matter of having a license agreement. But there are huge differences in whether or not you're allowed to share the software unmodified, if you're allowed to modify it, if you modified it, if you're allowed to share that modification, and if you share it, what license is applicable to that result. Especially if you take two different programs, potentially under different licenses, you merge them into one thing, then what is it? What license applies to that? What are you allowed to do with this? That's complicated. We have two big approaches in that area. One of them is the so-called copyleft approach, and the other one is the permissive approach. Copyleft, in general, tries to make sure that all modifications, all derivative works, stay under mostly the very same free software license. And how hard this very same is enforced can then be used to categorize those licenses into weak and strong copyleft licenses. Permissive is the other end of the scale. That's basically, here's the software, do whatever you want. Besides that, we have some special cases, but usually those two are the big categories of open source licenses. So let's take a look at copyleft licenses. And in that category, we find probably the most important ones, the LGPL, the one all of you have heard about. The general idea of copyleft is that derivative works are allowed, but if they are distributed, they must stay under the same license as the original works. And we take a look to the LGPL2. Then, even in the beginning, we see what's the scope of this license. And you can see it in the last bullet point. Activities other than copying, distributing, and modifications are out of scope. So it's really about what you can, how you can copy it, how you can modify it, and what happens if you try to pass that on. So what the LGPL allows in any case, you're allowed to make an unmodified copy, and you're allowed to distribute that copy. However, if you do that, certain obligations exist. Those obligations differ whether or not you're distributing the source code or a binary version of the source code, and whether or not you modified the software, the source code, or if the binary is built from a modified version of the source code. That's the correct way of saying it. So when you distribute software that's licensed as LGPL2, first of all, you accept the LGPL by doing that. And in that case, you have to share the source code with the recipient, and you have to inform them about the license. The rights that the person you share the software with gets, or that you get if someone else gives you a LGPL license, is always a permission that you get from the immediate author. So if you write a program under the LGPL, this program is, for example, distributed by a Linux distribution, then you're still the one granting all the recipients of that piece of software all the rights under the LGPL. So when you distribute unmodified source code, of course, you need to keep all the licensing information. You can't just label it with your own name and pretend that was me. You have to include a copy of the license. You've probably seen that, and even if you go to your Android phone, you will find a huge category with software license tags because free software is included in there. And if you charge money, you may only do so for the real costs of shipping it. So you can just charge money for handing out the source code. When you compile the source code and you try to somehow share this binary or object code, then in addition to that, you have to deliver to the recipient a complete copy of the source code. So when, for example, you build a Linux distribution and you compile LGPL stuff in there, then you must make the LGPL sources available to, basically, at least in LGPL2, anyone. If you're not including it, you must at least make a written offer to provide the source code for a specific amount of time. And these requirements bind the individual author. That's something that the person distributing it must do. So at the point in time where you compile something under the LGPL, if you release it, then you're obligated to fulfill those circumstances. When we say you're obligated to share the source code, then the first question is, what is the source code in that case? I mean, it's pretty obvious that it's like the program code of the program. But what, for example, with compilers, with header files? And usual, if it's something that's really standard software, like the GNU C compiler, is nothing that you would have to deliver with that. But if, for example, there's a special tool that's required in order to build the source code, then that might certainly be part of what is considered a source code. So anything you need in order to rebuild that binary. It's the same, for example, if you have an SDK for specialized hardware. And even if you have hardware that's, for example, locked, it might even be the instruction how to install the software on that hardware. We already talked about fees and that you're not allowed to charge for the pure act of distributing the source code, but you can charge for anything else. So you can, for example, say, here's the source code for free, but I want $1 billion because I compiled it so nice. That's perfectly okay to do so as long as you deliver the source code along with it. You can charge for support, you can charge for documentation, basically for anything but delivering the source code. When you try to modify software, then you likely create a derivative work. So something that's partially your work and partially someone else's work. You're allowed to do that, and you can just do it as long as you don't make it public again, as long as you don't redistribute it. The redistribution, that's what triggers the so-called copyleft. As long as you keep it for your own, you're fine. And there's no obligation to share it with someone else. But if you do, then you're obligated to first indicate that you made changes. Usually, like the Git log of the repository is fine to do so. And if there's like an interactive like help about window or something, you must point out that you modified that software. In addition, this copyleft asks you that you put your derivative work under the very same license. So if you modify your GPL software, you must put your modification under the GPL as well at the point in time where you distribute your software. So all those rights and all those obligations that we talked about apply to your software as well, starting from that moment. This copyleft is triggered in the moment where you create a derivative work from something else that's under the GPL. And that leads us to the next question. What is a derivative work? And that's where people start to have different opinions on that. So what's pretty easy, you take source code and you fix a bug. Then it's, of course, a derivative work, because the majority of this source code is still the original source code, and you just tweak that a little in order to do one or the other thing. If you, for example, link software to GPL licensed software, so take a GPL licensed library, you have your own program, and you link it to it, then it gets complicated. Usually, if you do static linking, so creating one common binary that includes both the components of the library as well as your own ones, then it's considered one work, like one binary, and then it immediately falls under the GPL. When you do dynamic linking, so saying I have my own binary here, and I'm linking it against the second shared library that's GPL licensed, then we're in the area where there are different opinions. According to the Free Software Foundation, it's still one piece of work. There are other opinions who say, well, it's a case-per-case thing. is it really one work? Like, it's two files. I have the object code for my program, I have the library, I have the binary version of my tool, I have the shared object file of the library. So if we try to somehow get a little closer to that, there are certain arguments for and against considering this one piece of work. One piece of work is pretty always the case if, for example, the program is just a wrapper around the library. If all it does is making certain calls in the library, or if the library, on the other hand, is only written to support one certain program, so if they are kind of depending on each other. On the other hand, if it's, for example, a standard library that everybody's using, like cursors, for example, just to put the cursor on a certain position on the screen, then it's pretty independent. Likewise, if there's another library that I could just use to replace it, so for example, instead of using OpenSSL, I could use GNU TLS, which kind of serves the same purpose. So there's no really hard dependency in that case. And that's where people start to argue whether or not it's one piece of software or whether it's two pieces of software. So this shared linking is pretty complicated, at least when we talk about pure 3PL licensed software. On the other hand, we have, for example, things that are usually considered not the same work. A compiler, for example, the C compiler does not become part of my work when I use it to compile a program, unless it somehow changes my source code, which would then be like some kind of automated contribution. The same is when programs are not really built into one thing, but as they just communicate. So for example, if I have two web services talking to each other with a RESTful API, they are certainly not like one piece, or if there's a socket that's used for interaction, for example. The same as if I have a pipe on the shell. So for example, if I do ls pipe grep, then ls and grep don't become one piece of work, but they stay independent tools which are just used together in that very specific moment. It's the same for depending services. If, for example, I have a web application and a database, then they are still kind of depending on each other, but they remain dedicated programs that I could potentially use on their own, so they don't really become one big piece of software. Hosting and software as a service, that's an interesting thing. If I take, for example, a 3PL licensed software, I install it on my server and I offer accounts for $4 an account per month, and I don't want to hand out the source code because someone else could do the same. So I try to keep it for myself, potentially including all the modifications and improvements I made to that tool. Then within 3PL2, it's not really a distribution because I'm just offering access to it, but I'm not handing out a copy. On the other hand, distribution, if I just collect different source code, put it on the same media, then of course that's also not one piece of work, even if it's on like the same disk or so. As long as I keep the 3PL license for the 3PL license part, I'm fine with this. And yeah, I already mentioned that what is distributing, and especially what does it mean for hosting stuff. Usually a definition from the US copyright law is used in that case, which says distribution means to the public, whatever the public means in that case. For example, if I'm a big company with several subsidiaries, is it the public if I create a piece of software and share it with the other subsidiaries of the same company? Probably not. What if I put it on GitHub? Probably yes. So in all of these cases, the 3PL allows us to distribute unmodified software. We can also distribute binaries if we deliver the source code along with it. And if we create derivative works, modified versions of it, if they are one piece with the 3PL software, and if we distribute it, then we are obligated to also share the source code. When we talk about 3PL2, we need at least to talk a little bit about 3PL3, which was developed over a pretty long time, almost 2 years, with a lot of consultations and feedback that went into it. And you might have seen that a lot of software is licensed as 3PL2 or any later version, meaning that 3PL3 is applicable to this software, but for example, the Linux kernel stays on 3PL2. So that's again a question of whether or not it's applicable to that software. And for example, in the case of the Linux kernel, if it would even be possible to get the consent from all the contributors to say, okay, we're gonna release the same software under another license, in that case, 3PL3 again. The big difference between LGPL 2 and 3 is that LGPL 3 tries to get a better understanding of what using a program means. There are two kinds of use cases. One of them is the so-called propagation, which is every use that requires a permission under copyright law. Then there's a subset of what's called propagate. That's the so-called convey. Convey happens every time someone else gets access to a copy of the software. So, for example, if we consider this case of software as a service and hosting again, in that case, we have propagate, because I create a copy, I try to run it, it's something I need a permission for. But on the other hand, if you're just logging into the software that I installed, you don't get a copy of that. So it's not convey. Same if I have, for example, outsourced development. If I hire an offshore company to do some development for me, they might still do that, and it's propagate if I use it, because they need to assign the copyright law to me. But it's not convey, because I'm not releasing it to the public and no one else is getting a copy of that. So the general obligations in the LGPL 3 are mostly the same as they were in LGPL 2, with the exception that LGPL 3 allows additional permissions, but only for the benefit of the licensee. So I can still allow the licensee to do something else that's not included in the LGPL 3, but I cannot use this to somehow limit what's allowed in there. The obligations are also mostly the same. So whenever I do something that's convey, like using it and getting someone else a copy of it, of course I still need to offer download for the software, or if I don't offer a software, I need to have an offer to deliver it later, but, and that's a huge difference compared to those licenses, under LGPL 3 I only need to offer this to the person who already possesses a copy of the binary, whereas under LGPL 2 I basically need to offer it to the public, so to say, again. I need, of course, to add a note that this is a license under which we're releasing this, and those are these additional permissions that we already talked about. One important thing in here are DRM mechanisms. LGPL 3 is explicitly not intended to license DRM stuff of any kind, so it's a pretty explicit statement about that. And on the other hand, if someone releases something under the LGPL 3, they more or less allow to circumvent technical protective measures to use those rights underneath the LGPL. Along with the LGPL, another license was released, and that's actually a pretty interesting one. That's the LGPL. The idea of LGPL is to fix the situation where someone is hosting a software, improving it to create some kind of benefit in his own service, but keeping those modifications for themselves. The LGPL is mostly identical, the LGPL is mostly identical to the LGPL, with the exception that copyleft is also triggered when there is a modified work and when users are interacting with that modified work remotely through a network. And that's basically the case. I'm selling accounts to something that I improved. And in that case, all those copyleft requirements trigger again. So in that case, I again have to make the source code, including my my improvements, my fixes to it available. So I can just kind of improve it and then keep it for myself. There's another copyleft license that's used quite commonly, and that's the Eclipse public license. You probably know this Eclipse Java IDE. And you might also know that you can use this platform to create your own software. So it's not just a development environment, it's also a toolkit to have windows and toolbars and a platform to create those Eclipse rich client software. And the Eclipse public license is explicitly made to handle the relation of those applications built on the Eclipse rich client platform and Eclipse itself. So that's, again, something where one piece of work could be created between the Eclipse parts and the own parts, and that license is explicitly about what's going on in there. Then we have the LGPL, and you already see that's a weak copyleft license, whereas the other licenses were strong copyleft licenses. The LGPL is explicitly designed for libraries, which try to somehow cover that area whether or not licensing is really creating like one piece of work that's triggering all the copyleft, or whether or not it might be beneficial to have licenses that are still LGPL. So someone who improves the license has to release their fixes, but still allowing people to use those licenses unmodified in their own software without creating the obligation to make all of the software available again. So that's pretty much the use case that's especially interested for companies to try to leverage existing libraries. The idea is that the library itself is copyleft. So if I contribute to the library, I need to make it public again, but the program itself is not. In that situation, the LGPL still requires us to grant the user the ability to modify the library, of course, and to use that program with a modified version of the library, which could mean that I share the source code of the original application as well, so that the user could compile his application with his modified version of the library, or that there is some kind of shared library mechanism, like, for example, sharing the object files, so that the user has the ability to recompile the library and link it with the original program. So it's not just giving him access to the library, it's also enabling him to use a modified version of the library with the original source code. There also is a version 3.0, which was released along with LGPL and LGPL 3.0. Yeah, basically it covers the DRM specific parts, and the copyleft statements are pretty much the same than they used to be in version 2.1. That brings us to the other end of those licenses. Like we've seen, those licenses are pretty long. They contain a lot of statements like what is propagate, what is convey, when is those copyleft triggered. So they're really trying to create some kind of system for the different use cases, and then have certain rules with certain variants of fulfilling them in what they expect the licensee to do. The principle of permissive licenses is far easier, and those licenses are way smaller. The general idea is to just let anybody do whatever they want to do with that. The nice thing is those licenses tend to be super compatible, because like, hey, do whatever you want with that. And they are really easy to understand and usually allow using licensed software and any kind of proprietary software as well. The most important ones are LGPL, MIT, and the Apache licenses. And let's briefly start with the BSD licenses. Basically, those BSD licenses exist in 3 different flavors. And the comprehensive version contains a clause that asks you whenever you market this software, make sure that you point out that it contains software written by the University of Berkeley, which is important if it contains some of this BSD code. And at the same time, you're not allowed to use their name to make marketing for a derivative version of that. And then there were certain reduced versions of that. There's a BSD 3 clause, which removes the part of mentioning the Berkeley system, the Berkeley stuff, because I might want to use this software as a license for software not developed by the Berkeley University. And there is a 2 clause version which even removes those requirements regarding marketing. And that's the whole text of it. So that fits on one slide. It basically says redistribution and use in source and binary form with or without modifications are permitted provided that the following conditions are met. Yeah, and then it's basically the reproduction of the copyright notice, and that's fairly easy. So the rights under the GPL are basically unlimited to anyone. So just take it, do whatever you want with that, modify it, compile it, share it, sell it, literally whatever you want, as long as you include the copyright notice, license, and a warranty disclaimer. And in case it's a binary distribution, just reference to it. You don't even need to include the whole license text. The MIT license is pretty similar to the 2 clause. One, it's again comprehensive rights. To anyone, it allows sub-licensing explicitly, and even that one fits on one page, so that's the whole text of it. And you see that a lot of that is allowed, given that the following conditions are met, and then the above copyright notice and this permission notice shall be included in all copies. And basically that's it. So that's super easy and again granting a lot of permissions. So what does that mean in practical? That's a pretty interesting graphic from a company called Black Duck. They offer a lot of software around license compatibility. And we see that the vast amount of free software they are seeing is MIT license. So it's under a permissive license that grants a lot of rights to others. Second one is LGPL 2, and we already see how those slices of the pie get smaller and smaller. Then we have the Apache license, which again is permissive. So roughly half of those licenses, even in the bigger parts, are permissive. And there's a similar picture on GitHub that's a little older, but I haven't found a newer version of that. But we also see that MIT is, by the vast majority, most frequently used. So in practice, a lot of people tend to put their stuff under one of those permissive licenses. And besides those licenses, there are still a few other concepts that we should at least mention. There's public domain software, which is not really, but which is actually a pretty funny concept, because the idea of just waiving all rights is not possible in a lot of legislations. It's possible in US law, but it's not really possible, for example, in most of the European jurisdictions. Whereas there's a certain expiry, but that only triggers after the author is dead for a certain amount of time. It's not something that you can decide on your own. There's freeware, like free as in beer, so not free as in speech. So here it is, and use it for no charge. There's shareware, there's shared source code, there's cardware, beerware, whatever, and not mentioned in those slides, but important to know, there are, for example, those Creative Commons licenses. So all those licenses that we've seen in this talk so far are specific to software. They are not so specific or not so well suited for content. If you want to license content, then you're probably better off in one of those Creative Commons licenses. When we think about combining software, and that's usually one of the big benefits that we get from free software, we have different things and we combine them to something new. Then we might see colliding licenses. We have, for example, one piece of software under the LGPL and another one under the MIT license. And we want to put code from those two licenses into one thing, into one new program, which then is considered one piece of work. So are we allowed to do that? Sure we are. Are we allowed to redistribute it? We might be. We modified it, we want to share it, so we trigger the copyleft of the LGPL, so we need to obey the rules of the LGPL. At the same point in time, we have another license, which might also be applicable to that. And somehow trying to resolve those collisions can be really, really hard. So it's easy if we have two permissive licenses. If we have BSD and MIT, both say just do whatever you want. So there's nothing that prevents us from putting that into one piece of software and releasing it under either of those licenses or even both. If we have two licenses and one of them is permissive and the other one is a copyleft license, then we are still able to create a derivative work, but by doing so and by distributing it, we trigger the copyleft, meaning that the result must be put under the very same license. That's okay from the permissive licenses point of view, because it's just like, hey, do whatever you want with it. So why not put it, for example, under LGPL 3? It gets hard when someone then starts to fix parts that were originally from a permissive licensed software, but this person is doing it underneath the LGPL. So if someone takes the LGPL version of the software, does an improvement here, then this improvement is again triggering the copyleft, so it must be released under the LGPL. So it can easily be put under another license, for example, BSD or MIT, that doesn't have those copyleft restrictions. So in that moment, it's possible that software kind of splits into two trees, one under a permissive license and another one being subject to copyleft. And in that case, it would be, or it might be required that an author submits patches improvements 2 times. For 2 projects in order to make sure they are covered by both licenses, because the copyleft license doesn't allow us to somehow port those changes back into a place where they are subject to one of those permissive licenses. If we have 2 copyleft licenses, things get even worse, because basically, if they are both strong copyleft licenses, we have two licenses and both say, hey, the result must be licensed under my license. And we have two licenses saying the same, and that's really hard to somehow resolve. Some licenses contain compatibility clauses. For example, the LGPL, like the GPL version for libraries, says that it's okay to use it together with GPL under certain conditions. So there are some of those compatibility things, but in general, it's really hard to figure out. There is on the GNU.org website some more information about how those licenses relate to each other, but it's actually really hard to somehow get an idea about that and to somehow do that in a way that software stays free and stays under as many of those licenses, or is not revoked from one of those licenses. I think that's the right way of saying it. When we try to somehow keep software around under multiple licenses, we have this dual licensing idea, which in case of free software might first of all mean that we release software under multiple licenses, as long as they are not exclusive. But it could, for example, also mean offering free and proprietary licensing, saying my software is available as LGPL, so whoever runs it on a server and improves it needs to make those fixes available to everybody. But at the same time, I could offer the same software, like if I'm the author, under a paid agreement, saying, well, you can either take it as LGPL software, which means you have to release all the stuff, or you can pay money and we make an individual software agreement that allows you to do something else with that, given or driven by this other kind of contract. The risk in all of those dual licensing things is that it's possible that software splits into two areas in case one of those licenses is kind of exclusive or kind of mandatory, and then can easily be ported back into the other parts that might be under more liberal or more permissive licenses. A lot of projects have so-called contributor agreements, but they try to make certain rules that all the contributors comply to. Usually that means granting additional rights to the original author, saying, for example, here is my software and you can all use it, but if you want to make a contribution, you need to sign this agreement that allows me, for example, to take your contribution and put it back into my commercial product that's not under a free license. That would be something that could be in those contributor agreements, for example, or that allows certain people or certain organizations governing a project to decide that they want to change the license later on, which in that case would require the agreement of all the contributors. So it might be possible to have those agreements in advance so that the permission to do that is transferred to a central point that then later on could take those decisions. So in practice, when you're trying to somehow apply this to what you might be doing every day, the easiest situation is that you're just using unmodified software. So you're taking source code or binary distribution and you run it on your computer. That's usually fine. That's almost always covered and doesn't require you to do anything in return because, it's free software. If you want to share unmodified software, then you should at least inform yourself about the rights that grant you the permission to do that. And by doing so, you might enter into a license agreement. For example, if you distribute a binary of unmodified software, you might be obligated to also provide the source code to it. So you should be aware of this obligation, and you should make sure that you don't accidentally create a derivative work. By, for example, having a software that might be considered one piece of work if it's distributed together with something else, then you might be on the fence of whether or not that's considered one piece of work or not, and make sure that you know on what side of the fence you are. If you contribute to software, you should, of course, know what's the license of the software, what may the original author do with that, and what happens, or what's the difference between, for example, submitting a patch to someone else compared to creating a fork and offering that on your own. Because, for example, if I just submit a patch to a project, then I'm not the one redistributing their work. I'm just saying, hey, here's a patch file under your license included in your program. If, on the other hand, I fork the whole project and fix something there, then I might have a lot of more additional obligations compared to just submitting a fork. If you're trying to somehow leverage other people's software, for example, you're manufacturing, small routers or something, and you would like to use some other people's software on your devices in order to operate that device, you should definitely find out what obligations you have in return, which might, for example, be releasing the source code for the firmware, releasing instructions how to install a modified version of that firmware on the device. And a general recommendation might be, for example, to always try to have a loose coupling of things, so avoiding to create one piece of work, trying to use APIs, trying to decouple things so that the scope of a license is always clear to those individual components. When you publish new software, so when you're starting a project or when you've developed software and you would like to release it again, then you should also try to pick the license that's right for what you want to do with that. Because on the one hand side, you might get feedback, you might get improvements, and you want those improvements for sure. You want to be able to do something with that. But on the other hand, if you're, for example, selling the same software under another license agreement, like dual license, then you must make sure that all the feedback, all the improvement that you get are under a license that allow you to actually do that. You should also be aware that by releasing software, you're also revealing certain maybe secrets of your business. So things that might be a competitive advantage compared to your competitors. But on the other hand, by picking the right language, you can make those code, this information available, and at the same time enforce rules that others have to comply when using it. So you can ask them to, for example, provide something in return if they build something out of it. And that can actually be a benefit instead of something harmful. So when you try to somehow apply an open source license to your own software, the first thing you should do is somehow be explicit what you want to do. So your source code should somehow contain a statement that is licensed under whatever license. Usually you need to add the license to your source code. The convention is to have a file called license. There is a software format, a metadata format called SPDX that you can use to tie license information to software. And most of the repository hosting services like GitHub, like SourceForge, allow you to have certain metadata associated with the license for your software. Whenever you do that, be prepared that you somehow need to interact with others, that people might fork your software, that people might contribute to your software. It's not just releasing it, it's also being able to somehow work with others and know what you're allowed to do with your software and know what others are allowed to do with your software. Getting this knowledge can actually be hard, and in the last 40 minutes, we really just touched the surface of what's there and try to sort things next to each other. I have a couple of slides with resources for you. So if it's a topic that you would like to learn more about, those are two books that I personally find recommendable, especially the first one. That book also contains a little chapter trying to explain what is a binary, what is a library, what is static, what is dynamical linking, in a way that even non-IT persons could understand it. And that's really helpful if you have a business person who needs to make a decision on licenses, and those decisions always are tied to this technical understanding. And that's something I really like about that book. The other one is in German, and half of it is about how to implement what that license say with the building blocks of German law. But it's like, if you know German, it's still worth reading. There are two links to the OSI and to the FSF, where you find a lot of information about licenses. And those are a couple of links to services you might actually find helpful if you need to get an easy comparison of licenses, if you need to find a license for yourself, or if you need to get an overview of what licenses are involved in software that you run or created. The final slide, and that's why I actually came to dig into all of this, is that LPI, this certification organization, is growing a little bit beyond pure certifications for system administrators, but we're currently working on a new certification that tries to cover business aspects of open source software, and that includes licensing. That's actually a pretty big part of it. And right now we're in the phase of thinking, what should a person involved in doing business decisions related to open source software, not necessarily a technician, but anyone who's in charge of managing those software, what should this person be able to do and what knowledge should that person have? And If you're interested in that, or if you have an opinion on that, then feel free to drop me an email. As I said, we're currently setting up the team working on that. So if someone of you is interested in helping here, you're more than welcome to do that. And other than that, it's time for you to have one or the other question if you'd like to review something that was in here. Otherwise, if you don't have questions, and you could still jump up if you have one, I'll be around the rest of the day. I'm at the LPI booth. You could just come over and talk or take part in our quiz. And other than that, I hope you have a rough understanding now about the different kinds of open source licenses, how they differ, what's common, and what might be important indicators in finding the right license for you, and how to contribute to other software if it's licensed under an open source software. So I hope you're happy with that, and enjoy the rest of the conference.